Yeah, I was saying off the record or off the recording, typically people want to just defunk to say what is substance is definition. But there's always a big conundrum of the question of secondary substance to primary substance. And they just think that's good enough, that as opposed to when you look at Aristotle's actual description of substance, he's relying on analogy across the way. Even as anageia is in of itself, it's a betrayal by analogy. He shows you it. So, but a lot of times in the academic tradition, in the scholarship tradition, has been just to say, well, we can get close enough with secondary substance of the definition genera, species, differentia. That's enough to get the job done. But I think it's kind of like anyone who's honest though, looking at Aristotle, won't give you a strong answer, especially primary substance, because the whole issue is primary substance, the substratum, meaning that it's fire, earth, water, like those elements, which is on the materialist account. He says, no, it's not really what it is, but it kind of is. So he kind of gives you like you can actually see in Aristotle's metaphysics the entire trajectory of discourse that's occurred of idealism versus materialism. Like everything's in Aristotle to kind of get started. So I'm sympathetic to what you're seeing, you're rereading right now.
Yeah. 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 And it's super interesting because you can tell he's really having a hard time trying to communicate it, because it is that kind of juggling back and forth of like, yeah, it is like it has commonality with this, but then it's different. It's different, so he'll always cut it with it's different from this, it's common with this but different from this. And it's always cutting in this way that even though you're right, like I could see how scholars would be like, well, the closer we get is definition, because he does talk about definition. I did read that part recently, but it really wasn't satisfactory at all. Even him giving that answer, he basically said something like it should be definition, but the way he's trying to talk about it, you can tell there's no way a definition would encapsulate that. Really, it's almost like the way he's talking about it is the definition, but you can't just give it in sort of one clean proposition. It's very hard to give it in a very, very clean proposition. So I do think, yeah, it's funny because it kind of reminds me of how even Hegel reads, because Hegel tries to speak speculatively at a certain point, and I think Aristotle's trying to work through, how do I speak analogically? And it's very interesting it's the same challenge of how do you speak about something, either how do you speak about something that moves? This would be like Hegel's dilemma. And then also from Aristotle's, like, how do you speak about something that has commonality, but also different with all these things? It is and it isn't these things. Yeah.
Yeah, so I remember the discussion about the relationship of dialectics, Hegelian dialectics, with proportionate analogy. So this is actually drawing up the point. And actually substance, ousia, is absolutely one of those touch points where this really comes up. That what Aristotle is giving you is a lot of a dialectical motion, right? So the parts, how they relate to the other parts. And he's hoping, or he's positing while he's doing this, that at first should be a revelation that you don't know, right? So that feeling unsatisfaction should be the first action. And then I think that basically, oh God, I forgot the secondary scholar who talks about it. Norschman, I think is his name. I forgot. But basically the activity of being. So ousia as an activity is what you're supposed to kind of posit back. So anageia with ousia, to see that relationship and actually notice the absences. And actually one of my areas I've got the most concerned about over time is archi, principle. What's the relationship with the principle to the substance? We don't really know. It's mentioned.
Right.
But it's not directly articulated. So that's an example actually right there. So, and actually in principle is actually the later scholarship in proportion analogy, actually use principle as what's called the anagon. So the anagates is that contrariness, right? Or that kind of two pairings against each other. And you look at the motion and movement of the relationship of the pairings. So house is the foundation, heart is the animal. Those are the anagates. The anagon is principle. So a principle is both what is house to its foundation and the heart to the animal. So it allows you to cross breed. So you can say things like the foundation of an animal or the heart of a home, for example. So those give you metaphors to kind of work with based on that. So this the root, the principle, the origin, like all that kind of language is drawing up basically what you're supposed to ideally, in my opinion, from reading metaphysics, you're supposed to realize that actually we don't know substance because we don't know principle. And we don't know it because that's not really been articulated yet, how those relationships work between substance and principle.
Right. And is there a difference between principle and account?
Oh, absolutely. Yes.
Okay.
Logos and archai, yeah, huge. Because it's actually for the sake of the principle that the logos exists in the first place. Meaning, if the principle is health, which is its end and good, medicine's logos' account is towards that, as an example.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Okay. You know, this makes me think of this is so interesting. I'm gonna bring up anger in this discussion.
Shout out to
yeah. It makes me think about, because I had this thought today of Aristotle. I mean, well, actually recently, where I was thinking about how, a lot of people, a lot of metaphysics, like Heidegger, thinking about who else talks about anxiety. Oh, Kierkegaard. Anxiety seems to have like this unique position. But I think anger has a unique position that people forget about, that Aristotle brings up, because, correct me if I'm wrong, but Aristotle kind of acknowledges that anger almost strictly has to do with logos, because there's a misunderstanding with the logos. There's a miscommunication of the
there's a relationship. Yes.
Yeah.
It's rational to be angry. There is idea of rational anger. This is actually from a theological point why Jesus can have anger, for example.
Yeah. And the reason why I say this is because in my own analysis with my analyst, the thing about anger, like anger used to be something that I was embarrassed about because it always came out to misunderstanding, which makes sense because even Aristotle acknowledges that it kind of has to do with this miscommunication of logos. And so that's why it's rational to be angry, because usually you have a reason to be angry. There's a kind of reason behind it. But what I think find more fascinating about it with my reinterpretation of anger is that actually, because anger has this connection to logos in some way, anger is actually deeply connected to revelation. Because if there's a misunderstanding and you find yourself angry, right? To me now, anger usually indicates a misunderstanding. I feel like there's rare cases where anger is in the form that there isn't a misunderstanding. Usually there's a misunderstanding. And so what I find interesting about anger is that actually anger can be the signpost for the fact that you have a misunderstanding, and you express the anger to actually clarify the misunderstanding.
Yes.
Why did you do this? It's this very fascinating prodding into the account of the other about why did they do this? Why did you act this way? It's a really weird case of curiosity, actually. it also kind of reminds me when parents get upset about children, like, you're not supposed to do it, so why did you do it? I mean, that's a real question to ask. Like, you know that you shouldn't, so why did you do it?
Yeah.
It's real interesting that way.
No, the key, what you're bringing up, Hobby, here is a dynamic when there's multiple persons and interaction.
Yeah.
That's where this really comes into play.
Yeah.
It can, in theory, happen. Like, I think when there's not other persons involved, it typically anger is the response to a denial or a blockage or a loss of the good.
Mm-hmm.
So which is typically what and that's why it gets attributed with emotion.
Yes.
Typically.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But it also leads to expectation of the anticipated good, which is of a reason that has reason attached to it or related to it. Now, what you're bringing up is another aspect of it, of what happens when people have multiple maps of their vectors of the good that reason is oriented towards.
Mm-hmm.
Reason is always oriented towards the good.
Mm-hmm.
That's part of Plato's argument and Augustine's. Why no one wills evil, because everyone's aiming towards the good. Because even when you do something evil, it's still towards a good. So therefore, it has reasoning and has reasons for it.
Right.
What you're bringing up here is the seeing anger not as a immediate, like a thing to be eradicated, regulated, and stomped out.
Mm-hmm.
We think anger is we have anxiety about it because we think it's so dangerous because it could explode into violence.
Right.
So it's right at that edge of violence, right? So it's like the anger kicks in, violence is right there to go. That's why the usual response is to suppress it, shame it, regulate it, deny it. But what you're proposing is that it's actually the opportunity of a sign of surprise, and it is.
Yeah,
it actually really is, and it is. So these glimmers of the beautiful is, and the switch from beauty to shame is always on a flipping moment, and this is a great example of it, because it is very true. When you get surprised, and it excites a denial of a desired good, anticipated good, and there's another, especially when actually even without another person, but I think especially when there's other persons with their own models of the good, vectors of the good they're operating under, that's an opportunity of encounter that typically gets shut down. It either gets shut down because you want to shut down your inquiry because you're angry, because you want to deregulate anger, you don't want to address it, so you just suppress it,
right, and
causes its own problems, or it explodes into violence into some way,
right,
impositions of will, right?
Yeah.
This other vector of the good, other vector that's blocking or interacting with yours.
Yeah. This is like, it's funny because I feel like my experience with anger over the years has shown that if you like, how do you make sense of people having, this is my rhetorical question, right? Like, it's like, how do you make sense of people having overt reactions, right? Like, you could say these kind of exaggerated responses of anger versus the anger that kind of leads to this kind of more curious investigation of, like, why did you do this? And in my experience, it's always because if you have an overt reaction, most of the time it's because you've already suppressed parts of it for a while. And then it just so happens to be that whatever this event was just triggered that, but then it also cascaded the series of everything else that you have been holding back. So, like, literally, I like to call it like the cherry on top. Like, when someone's like, I don't understand, why are you acting like this? Right? All I did was this. But it becomes actually the exaggerated response is actually in proportion to the memory that has been shoved away.
Yep.
Right? So it's the fact that when you become angry and you've been holding it back, the reason why it's so intense is because you've been holding on to all the memories of the moments that they did this and they did this, and they did this. But guess what? In that very specific moment that you're having anger, they didn't do any of those things, but it reminds you of all those things.
Yes.
And so you have this exaggerated response, but actually it's in proportion to all the memories that you're now recalling. And so the only way to prevent this overreaction, you could say, is to actually address the anger when it happens. So that way you don't have this compounding interest of anger, because what you're doing in the moment, and this is actually very hard for people to understand, is like, you're angry not for just now, but you're angry for the past.
Yes. Yeah. Yes. And especially what's going to happen is that when you do explode, now even if you were right to be angry, like your actual legitimacy in your reasoning, in your accounts of the past, you're the bad guy because you exploded.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now the conversation went from the actual content of what was his anger about to the rupture of explosion that's occurred.
Yeah.
And having to repair that.
Yeah.
Right. So thus, this is also that's the other aspect of it too, is that because on the outside it looks like it's the straw that broke the camel's back, right? There's another angle, another expression of it.
Yeah.
Right, where the accumulation just built up. Memory has a cumulative quality to it, right? So it doesn't go away; it just gets stored, held on, and then it accumulates. Then the one thing happens, and then it looks irrational. It looks unreasonable to explode because of the one straw. But you're not seeing it against this gigantic pile, and that becomes the game of gaslighting, manipulation, like all this stuff, all the techniques and methods come up because it's that gap of accounts, and one's holding it in memory. There's a large accumulation that the explosion is coming from that, versus the other side either willfully ignores or just actually doesn't even know. To be fair, there absolutely has no idea, had no idea this accumulation was occurring. So they're going, what is going on? Typically, that's the other side of like always these encounters of surprise. That's the other part. When I say manipulation and gaslighting, is that when the person gets, whoa, why did this person explode when I put the glass not in the sink? If you go around and go, well, that's not reasonable, and you basically shame them for that explosion, and you regulate them on that point, not asking the next question that followed, the more inquiries question of like, well, why did they explode?
Yeah. No, this is good. And it's also interesting because you can also take virtue ethics from this point of view, because even Aristotle acknowledges that, finding the mean in relation to anger or in relation to anything else is always difficult. So in relation to anger, if we're talking about, okay, so how do we get to the point where you can reach the mean of anger, which is basically, I feel like, also what I'm trying to get at. How do we get to the point? Well, ironically, it has to be through the attempted excess in the first place. Because if you don't have that excess of anger, how are you ever going to know? Because it's like, if you're suppressing it, if you're not actually articulating your anger enough, then you're suppressing it, and you're going to get an avert reaction anyways. So it kind of leads you to getting the excessive form of anger anyways. But the excessive form of anger, if you see it as an avenue to getting more in touch with the mean of anger, which means you have to force yourself to articulate. And even I do like this proposition that you're saying, like, even the other person should be more curious about why are they having this exaggerated response, right? Because I do think that's a good position to have, because sometimes even the person that is angry doesn't understand why they're having this overt response. Some of them do. They'll tell you, they'll be like, it's because you did this, 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 and this, right? But the follow-up question for that is, you could say, well, why didn't you tell me this sooner, right? you could always say that. But yeah, so I like this mutual play of even the person receiving the anger has the responsibility to ask, why now? Why today this? And oh man, I'm losing my thought here. Yeah, so this, you can participate in the surprise together with this anger, and actually you can move each other into the mean of working through that anger. Because I do think when you're able to say things as you get upset, ironically, you will find over time, and this is just speaking from my own experience, that you will have less and less overt reactions.
Oh, explosion. Yeah.
Yeah.
There's a very close relationship here of this right relationship to anger with courage. It's very similar.
Yes.
It's very
Yes.
similar because the
Very.
whole point is you're better off erring towards brazenness than being a coward. Like
Yes.
courage is much closer to brazenness than it is to cowardness, the cowardry, being a coward. So similarly, you're much better off having more of a, shall we say, irascible presentation than a suppressive presentation. There is a minority population that is much more extremely irascible, meaning they are way skewed to being brazen, and they will just let it be known. Disagreeableness, right? If you're going to use the big five psychological measures, like there are some people that just straight up disagreeable, and they don't really have a problem expressing what their problems are, right? But that's not most people. So thus, this is an example where sometimes you have to know yourself and kind of acknowledge subjectively, I feel I'm being too much. But it's because I feel subjectively that's the case. It may not be the reality objectively in terms of that difference between your subjective expectation and the reality is probably that erring towards that direction, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
You'll probably end up better off in the mean. I think especially because also I say that because two parts. Part one is we know that Aristotle says that, see, anger is one of those emotions that can be reasoned with. That's actually your point, right? So there's information you didn't know and you get angry and then you get told that information, your anger goes away mysteriously. That shows you it's not pure emotion. It's not this like 100% irrational emotional thing. It does have reason attached to it. There's reason involved here, because if it had no relation to reason in any way, then any account you would give would be useless. Yet it does change. It dissipates the energy, the activity. That's number one. Number two, also train of thought. Number two, it's the cultivation of the subject at virtue, who courage is being able to do what's right, to do the good that's difficult in the face of challenge and resistance.
Right.
Is that not exactly the same thing when you're angry?
Yep.
To address the other in a way that's constructive, useful, and practical. It's exactly the same modality.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's important because obviously the biggest struggle teaching Aristotle and the moral virtues like courage, for example, temperance is a lot easier because we live in a world of excess. We have fast food everywhere, distractions everywhere. Like that's very easy to connect to modern times. And anything that seems like so obvious. It's like that was actually that seems like a way more. That seemed actually probably a little less of an issue for Aristotle's time, because that was a problem with the affluent. The affluent had that problem, but because so people were affluent,
right,
temperance wasn't really that much of an issue. You weren't constantly having the temptation of like excessive food and drink and pleasures and all this to deal with. You were surviving for the most of the population. Obviously, the population that Aristotle was talking to, that was a problem because that was the elite. They had that problem, but that was not the majority. It wasn't a cultural, societal issue. Versus courage was something that was abounding, right? Because I feel like, because there was constant war. There's always an issue of war and death. It was constantly around you. So you had to deal with it. Today, we're so disconnected. We are the inverse. Temperance is very easy to talk about. It's very straightforward. Courage is very difficult to talk about today. So we're like, what is that?
Yeah.
Because we don't have wars directly anymore, not in the same way. Even when we do have wars, something like the wars they had, drone warfare, basically kind of professionalization of it. I think it's a very important idea that you could basically spend a year in campaign and then go home and you're back in civilization, and it doesn't like you never were in war. That's
Yeah.
very disorienting.
Yeah.
Like that's a very for the subject to deal with.
Yeah.
Just on the practical point that transportation is so fast now versus if you had a war campaign, you were gone for 3 to 5 years,
Yeah.
and that you were in that time and you basically had time and processing of duration to transition from war to civilian life, for example. Can't really do that now. Anyways, the point I'm bringing up is courage seems like because it was very martial based in the way Aristotle talks about it, and even Plato.
Yeah.
So it seems like we can't really talk about courage anymore.
Yeah.
But yet, this discussion of encounter of the other is an example of courage.
Yeah. 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 No, I do like your point on this. I think courage has now taken a different form because of, like I agree, like usually courage was more of like a physical in the face of danger, in the face of war. You could say even, now even in war times, we're kind of moving away from the physical harm and fear and danger, but also now fear becomes more psychological. And so courage, I think now does become more of a psychological act of speaking, dealing with difference. And so ironically, when we think about something like PTSD, and Luber would like this, is that courage becomes actually the capacity to tell your story. And I think anger, this is why I like your connection between anger and courage, is because when you're angry, it's because, especially if you're having an overt reaction, it's because you haven't been telling your story. You haven't been saying all the times that so and so has aggravated you when they did this in the in the bathroom, or they did this in the laundry room, or they did this in the kitchen or whatever. You haven't been telling them these things. You haven't been telling them your story. So courage looks like actually having the capacity to tell your story. And also, I think that's why psychoanalysis, actually, I think psychoanalysis kind of marks this transition on a psychological level as a mode. Because what I've noticed in my analysis is that it's very difficult to tell your story in the most honest way that you would like to, when looking at somebody in the face. The reason why, and this is where I think the account of the good is very strong and tempting against the other, is because you start to get an extreme amount of anxiety about what the other is thinking and what the other might do the moment you say this. Because you start intensely reading their face, their reactions. You start trying to anticipate what they might do. Actually, recently, my analyst decided to, she asked us to both turn our cameras off. So we'd have a virtual couch. And what's funny about this is that actually I didn't know how relieving it was the moment we both did it.
Yeah, I can see that.
It was instantly relieving because I could actually speak more freely and not get distracted with her face. Because if I start saying something, I start wanting to look at her face and see what her response is looking like that. And that really can tempt you away from really speaking something, because then you get occupied with her face, with their face. And it's funny because I actually start thinking, like, bravery, courage might really start really looking like, can you really say what you want to say in their face, like without withdrawing back because of how you think they might start to react.
Yes.
And that's a very frightening experience. Yeah.
No, that's very important. So two notes. One is from teaching. We absolutely do use pinging off the audience in the room to even the individual student. Are they getting it? Like this is picking up. So I think it's actually very important. There are times when you do need that because your responsibility is towards them, right? About delivering content information to them,
Yeah.
understanding with them. So you need that. But the problem is we do have a propensity to do that all the time. People pleasing, right? I think in general, because most people actually believe there is no, like, they think ultimately everything is just, they actually really deeply believe in subjectivity in the sense that it's just people's arbitrary wills that decide things, not reason or principle. I actually think that's actually a very fundamental point because rationally it makes sense. It is reasonable to make, well, obviously I need them to buy in because if they don't buy, I can't just give the reason and for its own sake because who cares? If they don't buy into it, then it doesn't matter. It's irrelevant, you know? So it's kind of that tension. So I think definitely your notes about courage on two grounds. One is obviously being a person who lives by principle. That's ultimately what Aristotle says all the time. Virtue is about is for the sake of the beautiful and abiding in the principle that the accounts even towards in the first place. So that lines up very clearly with that. You're not virtuous if you're not in that relationship. And that, I think also, I actually remember this the times I've had to do those conversations, like, stand straight up and have the address to the person to the face, where you have to go, I know that this needs to be said, this must be said, and I accept the consequences, whatever they may be.
Yeah.
That is a huge amount of courage because it says, right, like, this is the call, I'm doing this, and I will accept the consequences either way, how they turn out.
Yep.
That's a very different relationship because that's the thing you basically have to give up that command of the future, right? Of that kind of demanding, like, expectation of, like, I'm going to get this outcome. You have to give that up in this relationship with courage.
Yeah. No, that's really great. Because you have to give that up because you cannot control, specifically if we're talking about conversations, you cannot control the other's response. You can't. And so even if it's a misunderstanding, you can't control it. You can't even anticipate the misunderstanding. I've been blown away by so many misunderstandings that I could have never anticipated. So, and then sometimes you might even be surprised by your own response if you are on the receiving end, right? And then you can't even yourself maybe even mitigate that. And so it becomes this situation where someone tells you something surprising, honest, has the courage to do so, and then you react surprising yourself, maybe even contrary to their expectation. And what you have to bear together in that moment is that is the consequences. And it's not, I want to be clear, it's not consequences like this is your fault, these are the consequences, but it's the fact that there's going to be a result. And it's because there is always going to be a result after this conversation that these are the consequences. And so you almost have to preemptively already accept that there's a possibility that there might be disproportionate reactions or even asymmetrical reactions where you didn't expect the other to even act that way or surprise that way. And then you have to bear the uncomfortability of the fact that none of you feel comfortable with what was just said. And I think that there is where we get to something like, because I've been thinking about this, because Aristotle does call the mean of anger as gentleness, which always shocked me.
That's the mean? I thought.
Is it? I think it's gentleness. I think it is.
I'm gonna look at. I'm just double
Yeah,
checking.
yeah, no, yeah, verify it, please.
Good temper, gentleness. Yes.
Yeah, yeah,
I'm gonna double check the Greek for it.
yeah. Hopefully, yeah.
But continue as you go on.
Yeah, so if it's gentleness, I think I understand what he means now, because there is this habit, or you could say hexis, that starts developing as you find more courage to speak in the moment of your anger, that it does, I do see it transforming actually into the form of gentleness.
Yeah.
Where you're able to speak something and say it, and you're not having these kind of overt reactions. And it's really interesting how that can sort of start taking change and start developing. So the excess is really the way. But also, I mean, now because we have things like, psychoanalysis or whatever, it's the practice of speaking itself that already starts helping you develop the capacity to say something with courage. Um, and again, it's just all about how do we foster the
Yeah.
environment for doing.
Just to jump in, you're absolutely right. So beyond even that, I double checked. It is the New Testament meekness. So
Okay.
meekness is another translation of of the Greek.
Okay.
It's protesis. That's the basically the meaning of being irascibility and irascible,
Mm-hmm.
which is the excessive anger and the deficiency of anger,
Mm-hmm.
it's basically excitement. And it is specifically Jordan Peterson talks about this, but it is the right meaning of when we say meekness or gentleness, we mean this in this mean state of excessive anger and deficiency of anger. This is the framing of it's a it's a domesticated animal
Yeah.
in the sense that like a horse. A horse is a good example of it, where horses are terrifying because they're so powerful and
Yeah.
they could absolutely destroy you. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
by the power of these majestic animals,
Yeah.
even though it's that language I'm using there. But the point is, a horse is also gentle. Like their typical disposition of a healthy horse is very tame. That's why we can ride them. Right.
Right.
That's why we can work with them in cooperation. So it's very much this idea of a capacity that's present but channeled, right? So that's exactly what this mean of anger is about.
Yeah.
It's not the suppression denial of emotion. It's not nor is it the flying away where it just destroys everything, right? That fear of violence. It's
Mm-hmm.
this middle state between the two. But more and more towards the flying of violence aspect, meaning it's a capacity must be there and be present, and to have that encounter of surprise, you're right on that edge.
Yeah. 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 No. Yeah. It's that. Yeah. That's what I mean. Like, I finally understand like what Aristotle means by this meekness, because it's not like that word seems to associate something like a kind of almost sounds like almost a synonym for timidity. Um, you're being meek. People can even associate that with weak. Um, but actually, yeah, there is this. It's almost like you're able to more channel it properly in a very productive and conducive way. Um, and once you're able to make anger productive, it is revelationary. Um, it is revelationary. Most of the time, people get a little bit too preoccupied with, because this happened to me, which is when you get angry, you get a little bit too preoccupied with your symbolic identity. Oh, this is embarrassing. I can't believe I acted this way. I mean, there's room to acknowledge that, but it's more about the question, because the thing is, if you get too preoccupied with your symbolic identity, well, what's the temptation you're going to have next? Well, the temptation you're going to have next is, well, I don't want to get angry.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not gonna get angry that way again. I'm gonna avoid being angry. But the moment you do that, you're screwed. So the way to look at it is, how does one approach anger in such a way that it can actually be productive? And I do think it's funny, because now I look at anger as really a real experience of, there is an anticipation of surprise, but it's my duty to engage with that calling. Because again, I can refuse the surprise. I don't even know what it is. But when you're angry, there is an opportunity to engage with that opportunity for a surprise. But it involves you, it demands you that you actually speak your account. And I think that's the thing that you made me think of when you said, when I ask you, is principle the same as account? You said, no, accounts are for the sake of the principle. But what I've noticed, and I think this is the psychoanalytic account, is that people do not say their account. They do not actually speak their account from the point of their subjectivity. Because there's a difference between saying something like, I'm sorry, I'm having an episode. I don't know what that means. What are you talking about? What is this episode? What are you calling an episode?
I would go further, Javier. I would say both people go and speak their accounts from their subjectivity,
Yeah.
but they also don't even know their principle.
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, that's what
both.
I'm saying.
It's
Yeah.
both.
It's both.
Even worse.
Yeah, it's both. Because actually, what I was going to say was, like, the fact that you can't even speak your account means that you can't even get to the principle. Yeah. Because I think the point of analysis from psychoanalysis, at least in my experience, is that there's a discrepancy. We have a discrepancy. The discrepancy is that we have people that, nice, Luber is able to join.
Yeah, I yelled at him to get on. I was like, get on the call, Luber. Good time you jumped in, because we talked about story. So Javier, transition in and let Luber jump in.
Yeah, so okay, so the way we've been talking about this, Luber, is that we've been talking about anger. Maybe this will be the anger arc for the beautiful. It's the beautiful. But the way we've been talking about anger is that anger is an indication that you haven't been telling your story. Especially if you're having an overt reaction. So it's like when someone's like, oh, yeah, you do this, this, and this, and this, and this, and you also do this, right? But you only did one thing in the moment that triggered them. So it indicates that they haven't been telling you a story. So what I'm trying to say is that if telling a story is giving an account, and for Jockin, as we said, that giving an account is for the sake of the principle, but if you're not able to give your own account, then you can't even encounter the principle itself. So then we kind of have this discrepancy where people are, I don't even know what to describe. There's a split between people are regurgitating accounts, but they're not even being honest about their actual accounts. And so we can't even get to a principle at all, because people are not even being brave enough to actually give their own account. They are simply giving others accounts, but they're not giving their own accounts. And if we don't actually have that encounter, then we can't even have an encounter with the principle in the first place, because we're not seeing how it all works together. Yeah, so that's my segue into that, and so that would connect the theme. So
And actually, I was just going to think to build up to the story and theme. I think that's the whole point. Principle is very similar to thematic orientation.
mm-hmm,
Yeah.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, I had a scary on when Joplin threw in the exclamation point, get on. Um it's interesting what comes first, like in terms of having the ability to tell your story. Do you need to encounter the principle first? Or, I'm just thinking of like a 10-year-old or a child, right? Where they're able to speak their mind. They're upset, they're able to speak their mind, but they might not understand the principle, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, or maybe they do understand the principle and it's just more implicit at that time.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, I do think it is interesting what you're pointing out in terms of, well, for me, in terms of what affords someone to be able to tell their story. Is it the encounter of the principle, or is there something about the place that they're at, something about the space around them that affords them to feel comfortable, even if it's just word vomiting? I'm, I'm not sure. Go ahead, Alia.
Well, I think what you're proposing is that, for what I was trying to say is that most people don't speak honestly from the position of their subjectivity. They think they are. That's also another problem. Like when I gave you guys the example of, I was talking to my sibling and they're like, yeah, it's just my OCD. I'm like, what does that mean? What is happening? What's going on? I don't know what that means. And a lot of people would hear this now and be like, well, I know what OCD means. It's a obsessive compulsive disorder. This goes back to the definition thing that we were talking about earlier, John. All right. It's obsessive compulsive disorder. It's like, yeah, I know what it is, but what does that mean to you in your subjective experience? What is happening right now? And so people lack the ability. This is Lacan's idea of full speech and empty speech, in my opinion. When you lack the ability to fully speak from your subject position, you're not even able to even get close to articulating your account, and then you're not even going to get a principle, because the principle that you are talking from is not even your account. You think it's your account. So that might make sense of like the discrepancy you're talking about, Luber, where it's like, well, which one is it, right? Do we need the principle? Then we try to get the account, or is it that we try to speak the account so we can get the principle? But I think the discrepancy is that we have been self-involved in principles that are not actually our accounts. And so we can't really get a more refined principle because nobody is actually speaking from their subject position. But the problem is that actually people think they are, which is why you have to be like, what are you talking about? Like, what are you actually saying? You have to approach these people that, to use Daniel's terms, gutter speak, talk in gutters, and be like, what are you actually saying right now? And you know what's funny? When you actually start pressing that conversation, they start getting upset because it's obvious. It's obvious what I'm talking about. It's like, no, what I'm actually trying to get at is your subject experience, which is your honest account of what this is. And only when we investigate your honest subject position do we actually get something close like the principle. But yeah.
Liver, jump in.
don't you think to even give your honest account like that, you need the archive, the principle, like to even be able to express yourself where you are saying exactly what you mean. Like I don't think like because like when that kind of happens to me when I'm like what do you mean? It's like sometimes I'm people take it as like I'm trying to make an intellectual point, you know, where it's like, oh, what I'm saying so obvious. So therefore, you're trying to just make a nuanced intellectual point. But really, what I'm saying is, I don't understand what you're saying. Like, because I'm like so in tune with the principle in the sense that I can't see a real correlation to my access to the principle. So, how do I basically like it's 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 tricky because if you're like looking for how someone has access to the principle basically when you're listening to them, you don't know that they're doing the same, and you could tell if they're not doing the same if what they're saying is just so obvious, like from their perspective. um I definitely think when you get to that impasse, the only thing to do is to kind of like step back, like create space between you and the interlocutor, because you're going to be viewed as manipulate. Either it's going to be manipulation from that point on, or that you're just talking past them, or that you're trying to get at something that's not really even there from their perspective. Um, and this happens to me, I would say, like maybe weekly, whether it's with like my dad or my partners, like creatively. Ironically, it doesn't really happen with Emily, but I don't know. It definitely happens a decent bit though, and it's definitely because of the like I'm thinking philosophically. They're not. I think that's just what it comes down to in a lot of ways. But I'll pass it off.
Yeah, so I think so here's the thing. I'm a little bit uncomfortable with, if we say like, well, I'm in tune with the principle, they're not. Because the reason why is because I can't be really in tune with the principle if they're not even able to really communicate with me what is their account. So what that tells me is there's a risk here, right? Which is I might be right on the money and say something like they're out of tune with the principle. But it also could be my fantasy. This is the problem with egoic relations and encountering each other. Because actually that's something my analyst brought up to me. She said, is this just a fantasy for transparency? This prodding into someone's account, right? Prodding into getting them to speak it. Is this just a fantasy of transparency? And I said, well, it could be. That is the risk. But what's funny about that is the failure itself would be the revelation that is fine with me anyways. So if it's a failure, then I'll discover it's my fantasy. But if it's not, and I actually hit something deep within the subject and they're able to speak something real, then I am getting in tune with the principle because I'm getting in tune with the principle, because now they're able to speak something from their subject position, which elucidates my own. Because I think the problem is that, yeah, I have an understanding of the situation, but the thing is, if they're speaking in such a way that I feel is vague and does not give me any elucidation, then me forcing them to speak from their account in a more subject way helps me get closer to the principle. Because the thing about the principle, if we're going back to the analogy idea, is that we're always going to encounter this thing of there's something in common here, but there's something that's different. And we're always going to encounter this thing of analogy that I think makes it difficult to really pin down and having the principle. Because there is a sense in which I feel like, I don't think you meant possession, but having the principle is like not realizing that, yes, you have the commonality, but you may not have the difference. And so I think that's why it's important to force the other to articulate your own. And I think the risk always might be, well, maybe it was my fantasy. But that's fine. If it's your fantasy, it's still a revelation. Okay, it was my fantasy. Good. We are still progressing towards the principle. Like there's no problem here. But yeah, I do. I mean, I have more to say about, people interpreting your thing as a philosophical thing, but I'm very transparent with the people that I tell, is that, look, I understand that I'm coming from a philosophical position, but my honest position is that I am trying to pull something out of you that I think is already in you. But if I'm wrong and it's my fantasy, well, then my bad, but we can only discover this until you actually say something.
Yeah, to build on that, I was going to say, I think fundamentally, I think a lot of this comes down heuristically between, am I receptive to the discourse, or am I in a one lean direction trying to impose my view or my account or vector onto the other? I think that's a huge aspect of this, because any issue of manipulation is about a charge of, I just want my model, my vector, my operation to be the one to be imposed on everybody involved. Right? There has to be a willingness, like a context or a principle means the principle. I think Javier said a great job of it, right? In terms of principle is a kind of mirror. It's the mirror to actually reveal the reality of not just the other party's understanding or interpretation or framework, but your own as well. I think an example would be, so a principle like justice, for example, that's a huge one. So I think it's important to be just. You got to say what you mean. And then actually in the discourse, you can say, I appreciate you saying that, but what about this event? And like, it's also like recalling for other people. People live in contradiction all the time and they don't even realize it. Actually, it's one of the roles of the friends, is to help be a reminder, both in terms of when they fail or when they make their claim and then they actually don't execute it in their lives or enact it in their lives. And then the other way too, when they feel like when they try to disavow it, but they actually are just, and that frame reminds them. You see, like that's not manipulation. That's a mirror, with the friend being, it's like the mirror. The principle is the actual mirror. It's like the frame, literally the frame, and the friend is the actual material reflective soul to soul. So it's one soul to another reflecting back. And I think aspect of that is sometimes encountering when it's people are operating in fantasy, which is really just a symbolic in the imaginary, right? It's their imposition of a symbolic order in the imaginary to gratify some good. So I think those are the aspects of it. That's very different than you're doing this discourse space to try to manipulate and force your account onto the other and to get them to do something. I think that's a huge distinction. In that case, then you don't have contact the principle. Actually, you don't, very frankly. Actually, what your principle really is yourself, which is a very common one, which is the sign of the tyrant. The tyrant, and actually Aristotle is a common. What is a tyrant? It's a tyrant who orders their accounts around the self. That's a tyrant. And we have 4 minutes. I got to get out of here. So last rounds for anybody before we get out of here.
I I generally agree. I guess the issue is if it's perceived as like your account is orbiting from yourself versus something outside of yourself. Like the presentation, basically. And I think a lot of it has to do with the emotional state of the other person and also whether they themselves are a tyrant, essentially. Because I think, especially when you're operating from like the vector of like the good, you're always going to, it's going to be really hard to see the other person, especially if you're already like, nope, this is good. Like what I'm thinking, there's no wiggle room, basically. But I do agree. I do agree with what you guys are saying for sure.
And to kind of close this, something that I do like about counterfactual questioning is that counterfactual questioning, why this over this, I've had this experience multiple times with people in my life where you can lead them to a kind of revelational curiosity about their own accounts. I've had my girlfriend say before, I've never thought about that before. I've also had my siblings say to me, I've never looked at it that way. I've never even thought that maybe when I say something, people really don't understand my experience. And so we can kind of prod people out of that tyrannical position. Because ironically, the tyrannical position, and this is funny to even connect it to Hegel's dialectic, which is the master is alienated from his labor because he lets the slave do it. So if you're being tyrannical and you're trying to be a master imposing accounts on others, you don't actually know your account because you're having others do the labor for you. So you have to do the labor yourself. You have to speak your account from your subject position. And the only way to do that and to provoke people to do it sometimes is by counterfactual questioning. But yeah.
Very good. And that concludes this episode. All right, boys, it's been a fun time.